The industry's incredibly demanding. It is all about what you've done lately. You're either doing everything or you're doing nothing. Why don't we take a vacation or just like any of these things? Just even saying them, it's like, what am I saying? I'm feeling it. Feeling it. It's time to take the foot off the gas a little bit.
The AAA game space is very risk-averse. Every single decision that goes into a major games release, which often has a budget in the tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars range, is passed through an endless set of hands, rigorously focus tested, iterated on, ideally perfected, and eventually released, and then, maybe, if you're lucky, actually perfected 4 years later. And in that process, those with the highest authority are often prioritizing one thing: return on investment. If it can't make its money back and then some, if it can't find a significant audience, it's pointless. That's obviously not to say that great pieces of art can't emerge from the AAA space. They can, they have, and they will for the foreseeable future, but you don't just get millions of dollars in funding for free, unless you're Star Citizen for some reason. The game needs to turn a profit, and for it to turn a profit with that budget, you need to appeal to a lot of people. That means you need to review the landscape, you need to see what people are connecting with, you need to try and operate in a similar space and test things approximately 6 billion times to make sure you're reaching the maximum amount of people in that audience that you've decided to target. And when you finally give the audience the game, they'll say, nice. Now give me DLC in 5 minutes or I will set you on fire. Being able to ship a competent game that follows trends within that environment is difficult enough, but being able to ship a fully unique game that also lands a large fan base is significantly harder, which is why the AAA space can often feel formulaic. There are all these rules that you need to follow in order to succeed, especially when your publisher may have goals that don't always align with yours, and as much as we love to point at games that break the rules and say, see, you could totally do things differently. Look at From Software. They don't hold your hand, they don't make things easy for the player, but they developed not only great games, but also made one of the most successful single-player games ever made. This is clearly what people want. A lot of the time we forget in that equation that it took 15 years for the ideas presented in Kingsfield to hit even a remote level of consistency and acclaim with Demon's Souls, and another 5 to 10 years on top of that for that approach to truly hit the mainstream. Innovation takes time. Every BioShock needs its System Shock, every Metal Gear Solid needs its Metal Gear. Not bad games by any stretch, but ones with more modest returns than what they would eventually inspire. And today, with ballooning budgets and longer development cycles, it feels harder than ever to find publishers that are actually willing to take those risks. Which is why when we see somebody doing something truly radically different in the AAA space, it deserves an immense amount of recognition. For example, I have a very wide range of opinions on Remedy Entertainment's games, from this is a genuine actual masterpiece to this is really solid and fun with its fair share of issues to honestly, this is not that good, but they've become one of my favorite developers just off the fact that they're so willing to be unabashedly weird, with interconnected universes, endless Easter eggs, live action segments, and gameplay that isn't satisfied with the modus operandi of AAA shooters. If there's one thing I've learned with their games, it's that nothing is too strange. Alan Wake 2 is a game where the writer of the game is the actor who plays the fictional actor who plays the character that's been written by the main character and is also based on the previous game made by this game's writer, and that character is also a real detective who is trying to find the writer while he's stuck in limbo. I've played this game and I don't even know what I just said, but it works. It has this layered, deeply self-referential narrative that would come off as pretentious if it wasn't so gleefully presented by a group of people who displayed their love for basically every form of media ever created prominently in every corner of this experience. Even though I find Control's narrative to be far less polished, particularly in its presentation, there are visuals, abilities, locations, even title cards in that game that have attached themselves to my brain. And while I find Quantum Break's live action segments to be flawed pace killers, the fact that they even tried to integrate this into the game deserves some level of credit, and years later that gamble would eventually pay off. Despite the sheer level of dedication though, Remedy's games over the last decade haven't quite hit the same level of success as many of their contemporaries, even with gameplay that rivals the best works in the genre on top of the intricate and detailed storytelling. But what they represent to the broader gaming space can't be understated. They're one of the only major studios who are genuinely and consistently trying new things with the format and structure of video games, especially at a level of game development that's often defined by its rigidity and safe decisions. Every so often though, we do see other games try and make these big swinging decisions to varying levels of effect. As much as people memed on how Kojima spoke about it, Death Stranding being predominantly an intentionally clunky walking sim delivery game wasn't on many people's bingo cards. The original Hellblade is an experience designed to make you feel uncomfortable, distracted, and frankly tired at the end of any play session in order to effectively convey the unique story being told. Deathloop had an absolutely killer elevator pitch of mystery puzzle solving and decisions in non-linear time that was maybe so antithetical to AAA conventions that the playtest sort of spooked them and they had to incorporate a bunch of extra mechanics that ultimately undermined a majority of the premise. And The Last of Us Part 2's big swinging decision kinda split people down the middle. But in each of these cases, it feels like there's been a bit of a test bed to work off of. These games do take risks, but it's within an established design structure that has proven itself to be successful in the past. And it also helps that a lot of the studios or auteurs behind them had already built up strong bodies of work at a large scale before they decided to get a little bit goofy with it. But when I think of a game that truly charted its own path within the AAA space, that not only dug its heels in a gameplay style that had never been seen quite at this scale, but also did so with very little name recognition at the time, nothing quite fits that bill like Returnal. Returnal is an immensely polished game that's almost too good for something that has no real direct comparisons. It's got probably the best third-person shooter gameplay I've ever experienced, and despite its clear focus on moment-to-moment action, its approach to narrative is just as daring as everything else it does. It never feels like it's sacrificing one thing for the sake of another. It's stylish, striking, unique, thought-provoking, and most of all, fun. Returnal is everything that a game can and should be. It also shouldn't exist. The game's developer Housemarque was formed in 1995 with the merger of the existing studios Bloodhouse and Terramark, which for some reason they didn't contract as Bloodmark, even though that sounds way cooler. Despite a lot of their most notable games being made in the PS4 era, this establishment date actually makes Housemarque the most tenured Finnish game studio in existence, narrowly edging out Remedy Entertainment. Are they like putting something in the water in Finland or something? What the hell's going on? Housemarque quickly established themselves as the masters of coin-up arcade games outside of actual arcade rooms, and for around 25 years they put out consistently great experiences with tight gameplay and exceptional music. Arguably the height of their impact came in 2014 when Resogun was released as a PlayStation 4 exclusive, at a time when PlayStation was being criticized for its very bare-bones launch lineup. Resogun became not only an early favorite for owners of the new console, but also one with a fairly high attachment rate since the game was free for PlayStation Plus users, with many claiming it was the best exclusive on the system for months. Resogun was a fun twist on side-scrolling shoot-'em-ups that came with some fun perspective tricks and a robust particle system that would become the studio's trademark going forward. And while its dominance on the system was short-lived, Housemarque would quickly follow it up over the next 3 years with fairly solid outings in Super Stardust Ultra, Alienation, Matterfall, and Nex Machina, the last one being my personal favorite and sitting pretty at an 88 on Metacritic. It felt like the true next step from Resogun, a logical and exceptionally enjoyable evolution of the arcade games that Housemarque was built off of, flashy, fast, difficult, and punchy with some of the most enjoyable bullet hell bosses you'll ever get the pleasure of going up against. That game came out in June of 2017, and Matterfall released less than 2 months later, but somehow after that back-to-back release, they had yet another announcement just a week later. Except it wasn't about a game. On August 21st, 2017, Housemarque made a strong claim about the genre they had dedicated a quarter of a century to. Arcade is dead. In this letter to fans, they admitted that despite the critical success their games would often receive, that acclaim simply didn't result in strong sales. Even games like Resogun, which had made a significant impact on release, hadn't led to strong returns due to being offered for free by Sony at launch, and to them, the initial middling performance of Matterfall and Nex Machina that year meant that it was finally time to step into something new. I actually remember when this statement came out, and it was just a huge bummer to read, especially when you could see the lack of enthusiasm in phrases like, "The industry is moving more towards multiplayer experiences with strong, robust communities, and it's time for Housemarque to move forward with the industry." It actually reminds me a lot of the recent closure of Mimimi Games, who are also dedicated to a bit of a dying genre, and like I mentioned in my stealth video, while they don't indicate poor sales as a direct contributor to their closure, it's not that hard to see that as a potential factor. Rather than shut down though, Housemarque decided to go the way of the industry, and confirmed soon after that their next game would be a multiplayer experience. Less than a year later, we got word of what that experience would be, a third-person battle royale game called Stormdivers, and on the 1-year anniversary of Housemarque declaring that arcade was dead, they showed in detail what their future looked like, and if you look very closely, it's Fortnite. I mean, it's just straight up, it looks like Fortnite, plays like Fortnite, probably smells like Fortnite. It's like Fortnite without building, which, yeah, that's what that game needed to fix. It was really clear from Stormdivers' early showings that Housemarque had been stripped of what had defined it for all these years, and in retrospect, it feels like we were dangerously close to seeing them put out a dud that may have shuttered the studio altogether. Stormdivers looked soulless, cheap, and derivative, and based on the statement they released, that almost seemed to be the intent. It kind of comes off as a cynical product in that way, saying, hey, alright, we give up. You want slop? Here you go. Let's slop it up. Who even cares anymore? Stormdivers was lined up to release in 2019, but then 2019 came and went and nothing. No release, no new release window, no new updates, and then in early 2020, Housemarque announced that the project had officially been put on ice, along with every other project in development at the studio. Except for one. It was a project that they had internally codenamed Dark Planet, and Housemarque was claiming that it was their most ambitious and biggest game to date. The news went largely under the radar considering Housemarque's niche player base and also their weird limbo state at the time, but rumors did begin to swirl that it might be revealed at the next big PlayStation event, which was also set to reveal the PlayStation 5. That showcase would eventually happen in June of the same year, and it came with a bunch of reveals of a new Spider-Man game, a new Ratchet & Clank, New Horizon, a bunch of promising indies, that one game that'll never come out, Deathloop, a new Resident Evil, Stray, Game of the Year Bugsnax, and that other game that'll never come out. But in this absolute laundry list of insane reveals that makes me miss these showcases more each day, god damn it Sony, I'm starving out here, Returnal stood out, in both a good and bad way. It was the showcase's big unknown. Weird and alien, full of cosmic horror and some fantastic looking third-person gameplay, but also from a team that hadn't proved themselves at a larger scale yet. And the lack of direct comparisons made it a true question mark amidst all the other exciting announcements, which meant the studio had everything to prove and also everything to lose. At the height of Returnal's development, Housemarque was a team of 75 developers, artists, and other creatives, a number that aligns a little bit more with the standards of AA studios, but with the backing of Sony and an ambitious task ahead of them, Housemarque themselves declared Returnal to be a AAA game, and honestly, these terms have basically stopped being about anything tangible and are just straight up vibes at this point anyways. And what Returnal was setting out to do was unheard of for a game of that level. I mean, seriously, name one other bullet hell game that exists outside of the indie scene. Name literally one. The only answer I'll accept is Nier Automata sometimes. And you throw on top of that it's a roguelike, and one of the least persistent kick your ass just for fun roguelikes that I've ever played, at least at launch, and even in concept it becomes one of the only cases of a major blockbuster game that isn't trying to appeal to every single person who's interested in its broader genre. I mean, PlayStation is the king of third-person, story-driven action-adventure games, and ultimately that's what Returnal is, but then it goes, what's that? Linear story? How about it's actually an Ouroboros? Cover shooter? No, I feel like at some point this bullshit should be on your screen, and it's all gonna be coming out of a giant grand piano being played by some eldritch beast. Oh, you want checkpoints every 10 seconds to save your progress? How about spending 2.5 hours surviving by the skin of your teeth only to accidentally fall into a pond and have to start the whole thing over? This was not a safe game to make. In some senses, this wasn't a wise game to make, especially for a studio that was seemingly on the brink of collapse. But unlike Stormdivers, which was in development around the same time, you could truly see the passion in this project. Returnal may not have been a classic arcade shoot-'em-up, but it was that same vision applied to an entirely new scope, and you could see how excited the team was to create that. In interviews about the game, every team member echoes the same sentiment that gameplay is king, and you always have to follow the rule of cool, leading to a development cycle that seems almost like random spitballing until they found something cool that stuck and became a core part of the experience. When development began, the game had a much brighter color palette, but eventually the team elected to go for a visual style that conveyed more of a constant sense of dread, with its imposing architecture and slightly muted environmental colors which allowed the brightly colored VFX to stand out in contrast. Trees and other obstacles were kept to a minimum to not obstruct movement during faster gameplay moments, forcing concept artists to design open spaces that still look detailed and visually captivating with a level of verticality. Lovecraftian elements are also found all over the place, particularly in the enemy designs, which are also modeled after deep-sea creatures, leading to their writhing tentacles and bioluminescence. Apparently the team didn't even mean to make tentacles such a big thing in the enemy design, they just kind of stuck it on one guy and liked it so much that they copy and pasted it onto a bunch of other dudes. And honestly, I don't blame them, because the technology used to make these things is insane. It looks incredible. The VFX team had apparently been working on this technology since 2014 off the back of Resogun's own impressive effect system, and the results of that cutting-edge technology is best seen in the giant sphere you can run into in some safe zones. The way it morphs and reacts to bullet impact and then shifts back into place is mesmerizing. You can go back and shoot it with a bunch of different weapon types and it reacts differently. It's great. And if you've never done it before, you should, because according to the effects guys, everyone just sees this thing and walks past it, and it makes them sad.
I hate it. There's so much tech. There's so much tech behind this thing.
This advanced particle system allows for Returnal to look about as visually noisy as you could expect from a fast-paced arcade game without any of it ever being lost or muddy. And even though the extra dimension means you don't have the same god view that lets a bullet hell absolutely flood the screen with projectiles, the game accommodates for that by lightly reducing enemy attacks when they're behind you and adding this circular danger indicator to your character the same way God of War did a few years prior. It all results in an entirely uncompromised bullet hell experience. This boss in particular feels like something straight from Nex Machina in 3D, and just to be able to pull that off effectively and expansively with a fairly modest development cycle, it deserves the utmost respect. It's not just all about the combat effects though. The lighting and volumetric fog is incredible, with the game also randomizing the location of its global lighting to convey a sense of unease and unfamiliarity even in areas that you've explored in previous runs. And the vegetation sort of sways and clings onto you as you drift through it, almost like the world itself is reaching out and trying to grab you. To that end, it should be noted that Atropos is a truly alien planet. Like, it's not just a different color with some strange quirks, it is weird, and you experience that weirdness in real time with our main character of Celine. Besides a couple small items that she crashed with, everything else Celine uses to survive in this world is alien tech. The weaponry, the tools, the abilities, the health items, fabricators, parasites, the warnings on the walls, the means of deciphering that language, everything that's new to her is also new to you, and in that discovery there's no comfort, nobody to confide in. It's a solitary mission filled with strange visions and haunting mysteries. In fact, the developers actually removed NPCs and helper droids that they initially planned on including in order to increase that feeling of isolation. So really, Returnal had all the makings of a true survival horror game, but obviously Housemarque's arcade roots fueled this determination to not feature gameplay that was slow and methodical with a cautious protagonist. Celine had to be intensely capable and quick on her feet, and so within this horrific environment, you're a superhero. You have ridiculously high mobility in the form of massive leaps and air dodges. Your base movement speed is straight up nutty, and even though the pace is totally different, this dynamic of the daunting environment and extremely resourceful lead character is a clear homage to the Alien franchise, with Ripley also being a big influence on the character of Celine. Returnal's basic gameplay loop lets you live out this power fantasy within this horror environment, but it also doesn't let you feel like you have too much of an upper hand because of how brutally punishing it is. You can fall off the side of an area and you'll take a significant amount of damage. I've had runs where I go a full hour without ever being past half health, and as Jacob Geller mentioned in his video on the game, punishment is almost counterintuitively more aggressive if you're bad at the game than if you're good at it. The best example of this is the game's health system. If you're injured and pick up a health item, it'll obviously heal you a certain amount, but if you're at full health and pick up a health item, it counts towards increasing your overall health bar, which means you're much more likely to get a bigger health bar if you're already doing well in your run. But that's done intentionally. Returnal isn't looking to coddle you, it's hostile, just like the world it depicts. You have to earn your way to success, and you will. Eventually. And to hold you over until then, the game showers you with all these weapon types that just get stranger and less traditional until you eventually get one that's just shooting electric pylons all over the place. You're not even shooting at the enemies anymore, and that's somehow the best one. Your melee attack is a laser sword, your guns can shoot out laser beams, and outside of the Astrobot games, for my money, this is the ultimate showcase of the DualSense controller. What they do with the adaptive triggers for alt firing and active reloading, the haptics, like the little crinkle when you pick up currency and the slam when you pick up health, everything in this game is so deeply satisfying to engage with and fun to try. The gameplay loop is addicting for all of the massive, loud reasons and all the little details, with the world building and fragmented storytelling tying everything together and pushing you through all the seemingly endless failures until you can finally see whatever's on the other side. The game isn't perfect, obviously. Some of the roguelike elements are a little bit lacking. The levels are like a series of discrete blocks instead of truly procedurally generated to maintain quality control, but that does limit the amount of diverse layouts you can come across, and the runs can last a really long time. For people who are uninitiated with this genre, it might be hard to explain why a game that erases your progress after multiple hours is worth your time, and even though I insist that it is, with the game introducing a lot of narrative and gameplay elements at a pretty steady rate, I can understand why that might scare some people off. And I do think some of the reveals at the end of the narrative played a little bit safe, not enough to ruin the journey that it took to get here, but also not great enough to make the story as memorable as it could have been. But what Returnal is far more important than what it isn't, and honestly, I think it is the best PlayStation exclusive of the current generation, and for it to come from a studio that not even 4 years prior seemed like it was losing its creative drive makes it all the more special. Just a few months after the release of the game, Housemarque was officially acquired by PlayStation. Even though Returnal didn't seem to necessarily stack up sales-wise to a lot of Sony's first-party output, it was clear that they were eager to continue working with the team, whether because the game actually had a deceptively small budget, or because Sony simply saw potential in what Housemarque was building, enough to accept minimal returns in favor of diversifying their games catalog in new ways. Whatever it was, the studio's once dire-looking pivot had suddenly turned into a massive triumph, even if its unique draw confused certain consumers who just didn't understand how a roguelike could possibly be worth $70. Its release cycle absolutely proved the difficulty in winning over an audience that expects certain levels of consistency in game structure and quality of life, because despite having the content to back it up, this game's price was its biggest point of contention. But its acquisition also proves that those risks can be assets to bigger companies if given the chance. Another few months later, about a year after launching the base game, Housemarque would release Returnal Ascension, a free DLC that added an endless tower mode, complete with a few extra gameplay quirks and some exclusive story sections, as well as co-op support for the main game. It felt like a victory lap and an even deeper homage to the arcade games that Housemarque had put their blood, sweat, and tears into before this massive project. While at the time of writing this, we don't know exactly what Housemarque is working on next, it does appear to be a new IP, although Returnal has been far from abandoned, with Housemarque recently collaborating with Dark Horse Comics to put together a limited-run comic series that follows Celine's journey through Atropos. It's unclear if we'll ever see a true sequel to Returnal though, or at the very least a spiritual successor, but honestly, as much as I'm itching for it, especially after going back to the game for this video, I wouldn't mind if this was just a one-off idea. In true defiance of the AAA ethos, maybe this game doesn't need a sequel. You can just take what makes it click and put it into something else, or just do something completely different. But whatever Housemarque eventually decides to do, I really hope they can continue to push the envelope in the way they did with this game. As somebody who honestly likes a lot of games that come out of the AAA space and isn't completely cynical about that entire side of the industry, this did still feel like a huge breath of fresh air. It's something that we don't nearly get enough of, and if Finland didn't exist, we'd be getting a hell of a lot less. So seeing the studio continue that trend in the future would be honestly great to see. And even though this game's been out for like 3 years at this point, I just felt the urge to end the year off with something that we could collectively celebrate. And honestly, on a more personal level, I feel like the story of Housemarque's progression to becoming one of Sony's flagship is one that I've started to resonate with more and more as time's gone on. This struggle of trying to remain true to what you want to do and what you want to make versus doing what's popular is, for many creatives, a constant, potentially lifelong balancing act. And I've been having a bit of a difficulty handling it myself the more that this channel starts to do just a little bit better. On one hand, I see how aligning myself with what works for the algorithm is helping me get my content out there at a rate that it just wasn't before, but I'm always worried that I'm sacrificing things that I find important in order to attain that. This frustrating element of trying to do things my way and not seeing success has definitely bothered me at many points, and in those times I've questioned whether my only options are to become generic or to stop altogether. But it's situations like this that remind me that there is another option. It's not an easy one by any stretch, but with enough conviction, strategy, and support, especially outside support, it can happen. So in a way, the way Returnal came to be is just as important to me personally as the game itself. It's proof that upsetting the status quo is possible, even profitable, for any creative team. Because the story of Housemarque's Returnal isn't about how a smaller, previously indie studio adjusted to the AAA space, it's about how they broke it. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you're interested in my end of the year game awards thing, it's over on my second channel. I wanted to thank everybody who watched and subscribed and supported over the last year. It's been the channel's most successful year ever, which I really appreciate. If you're new here and you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing so. And I will see you all next time. Happy New Year.